And we want to welcome our visitors very warmly to their first public talk in Washington. We want to say thank you to the audience for joining us, as well as VOA and Radio Free Asia. We are happy to mark an anniversary, actually, Martin, especially related to you, because it's 17 years ago this week, in April 1997, that NED presented Martin with our annual Democracy Award. And the photograph is on the wall here somewhere, in fact. We cited your role as founder and chairman of Hong Kong's first political party, your unyielding defense of the principle of one country, two systems, and we honored you for your vigorous support of freedom of the press, full democratic elections, the rule of law, and human rights. So this has been a continuous effort, and we're happy to have marked that occasion and have you here again on the anniversary. And we're very happy to welcome for the first time Anson Chan, who has such a long and distinguished career in public service in Hong Kong, both in the executive branch with a landmark role as the first ethnic Chinese in that role, and also in the legislative branch afterwards, and now a public figure on the issue of the future of democracy in Hong Kong. We want to thank our partner, Human Rights Watch and Minky Worden, and all those who have made this event possible. We'll first just ask you how things went in New York. We'll go ahead with a few conversational items here, and then we will be allowing the audience to make comments or questions, so do keep those in mind. So you've been in New York, you had a public event at the Asia Society. Let us know how that went. What questions came up?
It went well, but as I was walking in, I was reminded by a friend here that the last time I came, I said to him that I won't come back to Washington unless something terribly is going wrong, and that's why we're here.
I think we were very encouraged, first of all, at the size of the audience, and particularly at how well informed they were, and how genuinely interested they were in knowing what Hong Kong is like 17 years after the handover. And I never thought that I would appear on the same platform as Martin. But the fact that we are both here should give you some indication as to the degree of concern that we have about what is happening in Hong Kong. I was chatting up two students amongst this audience who come from the University of Science and Technology. And I asked them, I said, are you concerned about what's happening in Hong Kong? The answer was yes. So what are you concerned about? We're concerned at whether our rights and freedoms will be protected. I think in a few words, that precisely sums up the degree of concern that we now see in Hong Kong.
This is really make or break for us. For so many years, Beijing has been postponing democracy, although it was clearly promised. We should have had it in 2007, but now we are not even going to have it in 2017, because Beijing would like to give Hong Kong people the vote. One person, one vote, but subject to Beijing's nomination. In other words, Beijing will give us puppet A, puppet B, and hallelujah, we elect one. So, and without democracy, how can we really implement successfully one country, two systems? Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong with a high degree of autonomy. If we can't even choose our leaders, how can we make sure that our leaders would defend our interests and our rights, particularly when Beijing might not like them to do so? You see, we need democracy to make sure our leaders, elected leaders, will find it necessary, not convenient, for them to defend Hong Kong's rights. And they must, if they want to be re-elected again, put Hong Kong's case strongly and will not allow themselves to be dictated to by Beijing. And then we begin to have a hope. But at the moment, things are going terribly wrong. We are going downhill at such a high speed that when we converge with China, we'll be converging low. And for years, my hope was to make sure that Hong Kong, if it goes down at all, it will come down very slowly, so that Beijing will grow, China will improve, hopefully, sooner than later. And when we converge, we can converge high. But at the rate things are going, when we converge, we'll be low. And that cannot be good for China, cannot be good for Hong Kong.
We are facing an identity crisis in Hong Kong, particularly in the younger generation. People born after 1987 who's never known life other than under Chinese sovereignty. Now, Hong Kong people pride themselves on the fact that we have an identity that is separate from the rest of China. We have core values rooted firmly in the rule of law, in open, transparent, accountable government, in protecting the rights and freedoms that we enjoyed under British colonial rule and which are protected under our constitution, the basic law. But today, we see all these values being eroded. We no longer see a firm commitment on the part of Beijing and on the part of the Hong Kong SAR government to defend one country, two systems. One country, two systems is all about giving Hong Kong people a high degree of autonomy and Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. And yet, we are seeing increasingly blatant interference from Beijing's organ stationed in Hong Kong, which is known as the liaison office. They have no role to play under the basic law. In fact, the basic law makes it quite clear that no centrally based organ in Hong Kong can interfere in the internal administration of Hong Kong, which is the responsibility of the SAR government. So it is a little wonder that we see that the ultimate solution and the only way to help Hong Kong maintain its separate identity is to press for full democracy. It's a very modest request. We are asking for no more than that Beijing delivers on its promise to the people of Hong Kong, which is that in 2017, we can, on the basis of free, open election, elect our chief executive, and at the latest, again on the basis of free elections, we can elect all members of the legislature. We have a chief executive currently who has no political legitimacy. We see an increasingly paralyzed government, and little wonder, because in the legislature of 70 members, the government doesn't have a single voice.
May I ask about that? It's been raised actually by Larry Diamond, who was intending to be in Hong Kong just last month for a seminar hosted by the University of Hong Kong Center for Legal and Constitutional Matters, and which is hosting a whole series of seminars actually on the question of the election of the chief executive in 2017. And well, first of all, he had a very nice quote that, in the press, and I wondered if you would comment on it. He said, "The authorities in Beijing have the power and authority to determine whether Hong Kong will achieve democracy at a particular point in time, but they do not have the right to redefine what democracy is."
Of course, can you imagine that although democracy was promised to us in the basic law, we are still trying to argue. We're still arguing, what is democracy? Now, Beijing says universal suffrage? Fine. That means one person, one vote. So we give the people the vote, as I said, but we select the candidates. And they say this is in accordance with international standard. But of course, it's nonsense, because the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, applies to Hong Kong. The basic law, our constitution, says so. And of course, the basic law itself, our constitution, also provides, in Article 26, that permanent residents of Hong Kong have the right to vote and to stand for elections. So how can Beijing say, because you are a Democrat, you're excluded? That is democracy according to Chinese characteristics. You cannot have that.
It's wonderful that you emphasize that the ICCPR does apply to Hong Kong. As we know, China has signed but not ratified it, but in this case, the basic law specifically makes reference to it. This, in fact, for those who are interested, there's a whole series of seminar papers on the website about this question of Article 25, which is the one that says every citizen shall have the right and the opportunity to vote and to be elected at genuine periodic elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, guaranteeing the free expression of the will of the voters. So then the question comes down to, as you've said, the nominating committee. So let's talk a little bit about some of the specifics of the potential format for 2017, both the realistic range of what you're really urging happens in Hong Kong. how would you make, if there's going to be a nomination process that may not be by party, but rather by some kind of nomination committee or other process, how would you make it? Are there proposals to make it broadly representative in a way that would satisfy your concerns about the Hong Kong people governing Hong Kong and to allow truly independent choice on the part of voters?
Well, my group, of which I'm the convener, is known as Hong Kong 2020. We recently put out a set of proposals, which is an attempt to try and bridge the sharp divide in Hong Kong on which way to move on universal suffrage, and to bring the proposals back within the strict framework of the basic law. And the only way that you can ensure that it is fair, open election, which is that people have a right to vote, people have a right to nominate, and people have the right to stand for election. At the end of the day, a credible set of proposals must have, in our view, three basic criteria. The first is you have to give voters genuine choice, not somebody anointed by Beijing. The second, you cannot set down unreasonable restrictions preventing people from standing for election. Now, you can have reasonable restrictions such as age, such as residence qualification. But it's not acceptable to say, I don't happen to like what you say, or I simply don't like your face, so therefore you are debarred. And finally, we think that you must allow people of different political affiliation to have the right to be nominated and to stand for election. So our proposals are predicated on these three basic criteria. And what we hope to achieve by our proposals is to widen the nominating committee so that it is truly broadly representative. And we are giving the right to nominate to all 3.4 registered voters in Hong Kong. So that way, and we are also at the same time insisting that there is a low threshold for people to get in and to become a potential candidate for chief executive.
So a certain number of names on a petition.
Yes, but we do not think you should artificially impose a number on how many candidates there should be. This should be a natural process of the nominating procedure.
Because another proposal, of course, is to stick with the nominating committee, but make it representative by constituting it all elected officials, even at the district councils, and perhaps some other additional, so that it would become, in that way, broad enough. Do you have a position on whether this would make it broad enough to produce the variety and diversity of candidates and freedom of choice?
Well, in fact, I don't mind what it is, so long as you don't give a particular group of people, in this case Beijing, the sole right of deciding who is going to run and who isn't.
Well, technically it's 800 peoples, right?
Yeah, but those people are not democratically elected by the people of Hong Kong. That's the thing.
That's the key.
Yeah, and I don't mind if they say, okay, we have a nomination committee of 100, 200, 1,000, doesn't matter, so long as all of them are elected by universal suffrage.
Is this going to be a point of negotiation, do you think, when the Pan-Democrat delegation goes to Shanghai in 2 weeks? It is to talk about practical mechanisms for setting up the nomination field for 2017?
I
don't think either of you have planned to.
I think myself that it's really a political show. It shows that Beijing leaders are at least prepared to listen to the views of the Hong Kong people. But what can we do in one day?
It's a one-day meeting.
Yeah, what can you do?
So a serious meeting would be a little bit more like some of the past negotiations before the handover, when there were serious groups that met. Is there any chance of that happening? How does that?
I don't think you
propose
will.
it such that it might happen.
I don't think you will have serious discussion of the final package until Beijing has sized up what the community view is. They will also, I think, pay some attention to how the rest of the world is reacting when Beijing is patently seen to be not delivering on its promises. So between now and when the actual set of proposals come out, which I do not expect to happen until early next year, we have to keep up the fight. We have to let Beijing know what is it that we are demanding, entirely reasonable demands, because I do think that Beijing does care about public sentiment. They do care about how they are seen by the rest of the world. So it's very much up to us, with the support of our, trading partners, to get that message across loud and clear.
Well, that's wonderful. It really leads to two things I wanted to ask about. One is about the people of Hong Kong, why they care about democracy. They have a pretty nice life. We all, there's a reason why people love Hong Kong. It's a great city. So what both their fears, you've talked to people who are concerned about their rights and freedom, but what are the signs that people in Hong Kong, if you can review for us all, showing that they do have a concern and really need to call the attention of the central government authorities? It is something that needs to be responded to.
We don't have a pretty nice life. We see two systems being undermined. We see particularly our core values being eroded. What are these core values? Openness, transparency, level playing field, genuine competition, the rule of law, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, particularly freedom of the press. But we are seeing increasing signs of interference in these core values. And this is really what worries Hong Kong people. Because once our core values go, we lose our strength. And in my view, if we do not have these strengths, what sort of role can we play in the sustainable long-term economic growth of our country, and in particular, in its quest to be a modernized economy? It is precisely by clinging on to the rule of law and our core values. These are our strengths, and we give them up at our own peril.
Let's look at Hong Kong as a society. Many of you know Hong Kong. It is a mature society. It is civil society. It has all the qualities for democracy, even though I do not agree with the proposition that maybe some countries are not ready for democracy. There's no such thing as a right. But even if you say, okay, you've got to be ready before you can have democracy, can you name me a single country in the world which is in a better position to have democracy than Hong Kong today? And as for the overseas community, Beijing and London worked very hard in 1984 to get international support of their joint declaration over Hong Kong, because they were afraid, both China and Great Britain were afraid that there would be too many people leaving Hong Kong if the accord doesn't have universal support. So a lot of governments gave their open support to the joint declaration, one country, two systems, including the US government. Now, every government that supported the joint declaration and continues to support it owes a moral obligation to the people of Hong Kong to speak up when something like today is going terribly wrong. And we are not asking you to twist arms. All we are asking for is fair play. After all, China promised democracy to Hong Kong. You are not twisting China's arm to give something which they have never promised to give. They have already promised to give democracy. They are already in breach of their promises. They kept on postponing it. So it will be so easy to say, at least, that's your intention. Please do it. And that's all. And nobody in the world would object, I suppose, unless you are the Beijing tyrants. Nobody in the world would object to democracy in Hong Kong or even in China. But where better to start democracy for China than in Hong Kong, where China, in its own policies, already promised democracy to the Hong Kong people. And so it's so natural to me that the US government, which has the avowed foreign policy of supporting every country for democracy and the rule of law, to follow its own policy over Hong Kong.
The legitimacy of international support for this internationally declared joint declaration, it wasn't a bilateral agreement, that it was supported, as you say, and it is the policy of the democratic governments of the world to support it. Can you give some gold stars of those who are stepping up, who have stepped up in the past to live up to their own declared policy goals? Can you give us some models of the kind of international figures around the world who are doing their best to support the people of Hong Kong.
Well,
Too bad. I don't want to have
Yes.
so much silence.
Well, unfortunately, yes. We're not seeing nearly enough people standing up and being counted and say, hey, we're watching what is happening in Hong Kong, and particularly we want to see whether you're delivering on your promises. You look at the co-signatory to the Joint Declaration, Great Britain. We're disappointed that they don't speak up more often. We actually have a very good US Consul General in Hong Kong who speaks up, for which he is roundly criticized. Martin has pointed out that we wish the British Consul General in Hong Kong would do the same.
But to the British government, unfortunately, Hong Kong is an embarrassment to their China trade. And money talks. That's our difficulty. But then, surely, as a signatory to the Sino-British Joint Declaration, the British government owes the Hong Kong people a duty to defend our core values. Chris Patten, before he left, that was the last governor of Hong Kong, laid down in very clear terms what those core values are. But today, to the Chinese government, all these core values, which Anson just summarized, are stumbling blocks to their exercising full control over Hong Kong, which should not have happened. It's Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong with a high degree of autonomy. But they want to control the way our press would function. We had 4 very independent newspapers, but now I'm afraid there's only one, Apple Daily. And that one is under great pressure. Advertisers are persuaded by the Central Government Liaison Office in Hong Kong, this is the Communist branch office in Hong Kong, to take away their advertisements with Apple Daily. They were already advertising. Take away. And these are banks, international banks, like the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. And they just did that. Now, when that happens, how can you expect press freedom to continue? It's so easy for these communists to say to these bankers, don't worry, take your advertisement away from this newspaper, give it to other newspapers, we will talk to your competitors. So don't worry, nobody will advertise with Apple Daily, you won't suffer, there are other newspapers, go and do it. And so easy. And so this newspaper was very thick, getting thinner, when the advertisements are no longer there.
I think it's extremely short-sighted for business to think that by acquiescing, they're serving their best long-term interests. It is my experience that if you roll over and you pull your punches, it will only encourage the Chinese to demand more the next time round.
Too many people in business, in particular, believe that if instead of shaking their hand with the Beijing counterparts, if they bow to give respect, they're going to have more business. But once you bow, they expect you to kneel down, and once you kneel down, they expect you to kneel down and kowtow. But if you stand firm, they have respect for you. Otherwise, if you kowtow to them, you are in their pocket. And who are you then? And if you are in business, surely the free flow of economic information is of paramount importance to you if you want to invest in anything. But when freedom of the press is under threat, and if it disappears from Hong Kong, how can your investment be saved? Be safe in Hong Kong. The rule of law still is okay. But you see, we are encountering a lot of problems. Xi Jinping, the president of China, 2 years ago came to Hong Kong and said to our chief justice and other senior officials on a public occasion that our judges must cooperate more with our government. That's his view. I mean, And I can understand that. As a communist leader, he expects the Hong Kong judges to behave like Chinese judges, cooperate with the government. Well, they're doing that in Singapore now. But that can't be right. And a very senior judge in Hong Kong, sitting in the Court of Final Appeal, retired about a year ago. And on his retirement, he said that a storm of unprecedented ferocity is coming to Hong Kong. He was talking about the rule of law. And the rule of law is what makes Hong Kong a different city than all other Chinese cities. And if even this judge thinks that it's under threat, coupled with the Chinese leaders' words to our Chief Justice, there should be great concern on the part of our overseas investors. But would they speak up? Would the Chambers of Commerce speak up? They'd rather other people do it for them.
Well, there's one opportunity coming up. I wanted to go back to one of the policy instruments that in this country has been used to support the fulfilling of the promise for one country, two systems, which is the Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992. And if maybe you could remind us what's in that act and tell us whether you thought it did some good and what's next.
Well, the act was introduced by Senator Mitch McConnell. It's called the Mitch McConnell bill at the time. The policy was based on one country, two systems. So that act requires the US government to treat Hong Kong as separate from the rest of China in terms of trade quotas in those days, immigration quotas, and other things. Treating Hong Kong as separate from China. Now, and yet, on many of my previous visits to Washington, D.C., I was told by people that don't expect too much. There is too much on our China plate. And my answer has always been, fine, no problem, because there is a separate Hong Kong plate. And under your act of Congress, and the Hong Kong plate is empty. It's smaller, of course, but it's empty. So there is no reason why your government should, because of other matters concerning China, then to ignore its moral obligations towards the people of Hong Kong.
So if this is now, I understand, action is needed to reauthorize?
Well, the reporting has stopped, I think, 15 years after the act was enacted, was promulgated in 1992. But that is one of our objectives of going to the Hill, and that is trying to persuade that the yearly reporting should be reintroduced so that members of Congress would know what's happening.
Very good. And let me ask you something a little more out of the mainstream, which is whether do you think there are interests in China itself who may agree with you in principle, who may understand what's at stake, who perhaps quietly are learning from your experience? Who are the constituencies in China who have also a concern for the future of
I think it's
democracy in Hong
important
Kong?
to bear in mind that the leadership hierarchy is not monolithic. You have those who are more open-minded, more reform-minded, and yes, you have the hardliners. What I think we in Hong Kong need to do is to make sure that we give some encouragement to the moderate voice in China pressing for changes, because they believe this to be in the best interest of China as a whole. We actually have people in the mainland coming to Hong Kong to participate in the annual candlelight vigil to commemorate June the 4th. We have mainlanders coming to Hong Kong to participate in the now annual July the 1st demonstration. And we have people coming up to me, to Martin, urging us to keep up the fight, because that is the only way in which they themselves are going to be able to influence the way that the country as a whole moves. So we have to give some encouragement to this moderate voice. In the same way as when we receive support from countries around the world, people in Hong Kong draw encouragement from there.
Any questions or comments from the audience? And see whether you'd like to make any comments here. So we have one from a media representative. Yes, so I'll call on Radio Free Asia, right here in the front row. And the mic is coming.
Martin and Anson, welcome to town. But I have to say, since I listen to your Cantonese and Mandarin, I differentiate that your speeches has different tones. When you mention China, you mention Zhongyang or Beijing in Cantonese. But when you mention in English, you normally use the communists. So my question would be, will you be more tough, or should you be more tough in Hong Kong in bringing out that the so-called Beijing government is still a communist ruling party to handle the things that very rigid? Would you do more in arousing the Hong Kong people's awareness that the sovereign country is in fact still a hardline communist leader? Thank you.
I think Hong Kong people know precisely that. I mean, how many people in Hong Kong would not know that the central government in Beijing consists of communists and only communists, because it's a one-party state. But Hong Kong people surely know that.
Well, maybe as a career civil servant, I tend to be more cautious. I'm always very conscious of the fact that it is one country, two systems. And if we about one-party system rule in Beijing, we need to draw a fine balance in how we are seen to be criticizing Beijing one-party system rule. Because this is one thing that they do fear. They're afraid that we will impose our values on mainland China. They're afraid that if they give Hong Kong people one man, one vote, we will elect a chief executive who will confront Beijing at every turn. Not so. There is absolutely no foundation for this sort of belief. I have no doubt that if tomorrow you give the vote to Hong Kong people, they will use that vote in their hands very wisely. They will elect a chief executive who can deal with China, with the mainland, and at the same time has the support of Hong Kong people because he is fully committed to implementing two systems.
May I interject then a question on that front, which is the question not so much of the principle, the promise, even the desires of the Hong Kong people to ensure their checks and balances to preserve their core principles in the way of life, and all the very eloquent arguments you've made for why democracy is really important for the people of Hong Kong. What about a pure consequentialist rather than theoretical argument, which is, or normative argument, which is simply the governability question? If the chief executive loses measures of legitimacy, you mentioned this yourself about, without party allies in a legislature, even in an executive-led government, what does that do for governability, the ability to address public policy questions? And is that really coming? Are there ways to do surveys to get at that? And if so, would it be persuasive to some in Beijing that having a to boost the legitimacy of the government in Hong Kong is in the interest of the central government to have a governable Hong Kong rather than one where
No, you are
governability
absolutely
is a
right.
problem?
I mean, we're fighting for democracy, not just because it is our basic right, not just because it is a promise that Beijing made solemnly to the people of Hong Kong, but at the root of it all is the whole question of governability of Hong Kong. Now, the chief secretary of the current SAR government has said on several occasions that if we make no progress on achieving genuine universal suffrage in 2017, then in her view, Hong Kong will become increasingly ungovernable. We have a chief executive who has no political mandate to govern. Political parties are not encouraged in Hong Kong, although it is only by local legislation, and we can easily change local legislation on our own. So, and it must matter to the business sector that this government can govern Hong Kong effectively, can be seen to be tackling thorny, difficult issues that have an impact on the whole business environment.
The current chief executive doesn't command the respect or trust of Hong Kong people at all. He is called in a number of Chinese newspapers as the lying chief executive, because the public perception is that he won the election in 2012 by cheating the public that he had no illegal structures at his home, and he actually accused his principal opponent of having illegal structures at his home. So there's absolutely no credibility with Hong Kong people. And therefore, sometimes he comes up with good proposals, and even then the Hong Kong people won't support it. And on this current issue of how to go about the electoral laws, how to amend them, he won't even dare to say anything now. Originally, he said that that was his portfolio. Now he passed it on to the chief secretary, because he knows that if he were to push for it, it would be much worse than now. So how can you have a leader? Where in the world would you find a leader who has lost completely the trust of the people he governs? Now, in a democratic country or city, of course he would have gone. But he's still aspiring for a second term in 2017.
Think about ways to make the case more strongly to the people making policy in Beijing. I mean, it seems to me this is one of the strongest things that needs to be brought to their attention, rather than argument about defining democracy, because as we've seen in China's entire system, as well as for the future of Hong Kong, you can spend a lot of time arguing about what the promise was and what would fulfill it, and maybe some more appeal to interest and governability may make some more headway. So the next person is in the back, and then please do identify yourself, everyone who gets the microphone.
Hi, my name is Nadia Chao, Washington correspondent for Liberty Times from Taiwan. Actually, there was a big demonstration in Taiwan, and many people, one of the slogans they said is that they don't want to become next Hong Kong. So from your point of view, especially the economic agreement you made with China, would you give us, an idea how that benefits or damages Hong Kong's future? And also, do you think Taiwan can do more for, Hong Kong's democracy? How could these two, society work together? Thank you.
I think the closer economic integration between Hong Kong and the mainland is normal, to be expected, and generally welcomed by the community. But what concerns the community now is their growing sense that Beijing is using economic integration, economic sweetness to subvert two systems and to erode our core values. And the community as a whole, particularly the younger generation, will not stand for this. And what has happened recently in Beijing, I think actually gives encouragement, particularly to the younger generation, that in the event that Beijing fails to deliver a credible set of universal suffrage proposals, they might resort to the same action. I hope sincerely it won't come to that. But there is concern. We welcome economic integration, but we are not prepared to accept economic integration at the expense of giving up our core values.
I think economic cooperation would be a better word. But one sees only too clearly that Beijing is using that for a particular motive. And the motive is to make Hong Kong getting more and more economically dependent on Beijing of their independence. Born in 1997. The name is Joshua Wong. A year ago, it was revealed that the Hong Kong government wanted to brainwash our kids at schools. And Joshua Wong and his young students formed an alliance of young students from different schools, and they demonstrated in the streets against that. Originally, there were about 20 of them. And then it grew to larger numbers, supported by parents. There was another group of parents, nothing to do with political parties. So the group of students and the group of parents continued to demonstrate until there were 100,000 people gathered around central government, or our government, in their offices. And that forced the government openly to abandon the sort of patriotic education. So we have a young student leader.
Terrific. We have, I believe, 2 ambassadors right in the front row. We better call on them next. Do we have the microphone down here? Yes, either one.
Thanks. I'm Mark Lagon, on the Georgetown faculty and at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you for coming to the United States. Don't be strangers. Even for those who are professionally devoted to promoting democracy, you remind us of the principles that we are working on when you come. I was very interested in your description of the intimidation or the dissuasion being delivered on the business community and advertising in Apple Daily. I wondered if the two of you might speak to freedom of the press and freedom of expression and the balance between actual censorship, actual pressure, even pressure behind the scenes, and self-censorship. Your feeling now at this stage.
Well, self-censorship has been a cause for concern for several years now. But a series of recent incidents culminating in this very vicious attack against the ex-chief editor of Ming Pao. He was brutally attacked and slashed, and he's going to be in hospital for a long, long time. Plus, the sacking of a very popular talk show hostess simply because she is articulate and she is a vocal critic of the government. The fact that increasingly Beijing seems to be muscling in on press comments, press commentary, and using the liaison office to apply pressure on what are purely commercial decisions about where you place your advertisements. So all this has led Hong Kong people to wonder, how much longer are we going to have press freedom? What is going to happen to free flow of information and freedom of expression? It's not just that Hong Kong people are worried about hanging on to this very basic right, but the commercial sector should be concerned too, because surely the commercial sector want an unfettered press, free flow of information. You want a certain business environment, you want access to accurate, available information. So how does it serve the commercial interest if you muscle in to requests from the liaison office to do this and do that? It's the first step down a slippery slope.
To me, freedom of the press is the freedom of all freedoms. Because without it, then when your other freedoms are taken away from you, nobody will know about it. And so as this happens in Hong Kong like this, getting worse and worse, there is every reason for fear that what was promised to us in 1984 in the Sino-British Joint Declaration, everything is fast disappearing. That is why we must do something. We must be able to do something to stop this erosion of our freedoms. And that is to make sure that when we do elect our chief executive and our legislators in 2017 and 2020 respectively, it must be genuine democracy. Otherwise, our leaders would not find it necessary to stand up for Hong Kong.
We want a free press because, apart from other considerations, a free press plays a very important role as a check and balance against executive power. And it's particularly important at this juncture in Hong Kong because we have a government that is increasingly opaque, that takes decisions that go against their publicly stated stance. And we're none the wiser. And it doesn't serve business interests because if you chop and change and you can arbitrarily make decisions to affect the business environment, where does this business sector stand? And we've had some very good recent examples of this. The government had a declared policy that it's going to issue freely licenses for free TV licenses without limit, so long as the applicants meet basic qualifications. This was the government's stated policy. So 3 applicants put in their submissions for this free TV license. And out of the blue, against his own professional advice, against advice from his own cabinet, the chief executive decided, no, we're not going to issue 3 licenses in response to 3 applications. I have decided we will do this in a steady and gradual manner, and we are only going to issue 2 licenses. And the public draws the right conclusion that the 3rd applicant is being denied a license because the government doesn't happen to like what he has been saying. And yet, in the public eye, he's the only one who was prepared to put money in to produce quality TV drama series that the public wanted to see. So why is the government doing this? This is just, one illustration of how this government is becoming increasingly opaque and doing all sorts of things behind the scene. And we're none the wiser until it actually hits us. And there's nothing we can do because we have no power to vote him out of office.
Yes.
I'm Grover Joseph Reese, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about what Anson Chan said about people from China coming to Hong Kong, participating in demonstrations, coming up to her and to other pro-democracy advocates and saying, please keep it up because it's our only chance. On the one hand, that's wonderful, and that's what we all hoped one country, 2 systems might produce. On the other hand, given the precarious state of democracy in Hong Kong, isn't this the very last thing you want the government in Beijing to know about? Isn't it the very thing they're worried about? Actually, if they could be sure that democracy in Hong Kong would not infect the mainland, wouldn't they be more likely to give it to you?
Well, I can well understand the reluctance on the part of the Beijing leaders to let Hong Kong enjoy democracy. But surely, if they want China to continue to grow economically and to grow into a world power, not just in terms of money, but in terms of ensuring that their people's rights are respected by the state, surely it has to follow. And if Beijing is reluctant to start with democracy in mainland China, then the very good thing to do is to let Hong Kong develop democracy as was already promised. Because I'm sure that it will work well for Hong Kong. And then China can then take comfort and then say, well, there's really nothing to worry about. This is Chinese society, and they have democracy now. Things are going very well, even better than before. Then that will then give them courage and confidence to start with their own villages, towns, and cities, and provinces, and finally to the whole state. So Hong Kong can be a special democratic zone.
Vision. All right, so we'll ask Buchong Tsering to give his question next.
Buchong from the International Campaign for Tibet. Both of you seem to indicate that there's a failure in the Chinese government's implementation of its promises for the Hong Kong people at the broader level. But I wonder whether you could comment on a specific clause in the basic law that was also put in to preserve and protect Hong Kong's identity, namely not allowing Chinese from mainland to settle permanently in Hong Kong. How has the Chinese people taken that clause in the basic law? Because in the Tibetan case, when the Tibetans have started saying that they needed to have Tibetans majority in the Tibetan areas, the Chinese government has been using that with the Chinese people to say that Tibetans don't want Chinese in Tibetan areas. So I was wondering how the Hong Kong people have been able to manage with that and how the Chinese people have reacted to it.
Let me just clarify. It is true that a mainlander cannot just come into Hong Kong and expect to settle permanently. But we do actually have a binding agreement with mainland authorities whereby under the one-way permit scheme, we take into Hong Kong for permanent residency 150 people a day. Now, these are largely for family reunion purposes, because over the years we've seen people in Hong Kong marrying mainlanders. They have children, but they have to come into Hong Kong in an orderly way under this quota. And in a way, we welcome this because our natural population is below net replacement rate, and we do need an active working population to sustain Hong Kong's economic growth. But Hong Kong is a very, very small place with limited facilities and limited social and health facilities. So we need to regulate the numbers coming in. And these people come in, and to the extent that we are successful in assimilating them, they are as much a part of the community as people born in Hong Kong.
The problem about that is the implementation of it. Because the Hong Kong government has no say at all as to who these 150 guys who are coming into Hong Kong on a one-way permit, because the one-way permit was issued by the central government, and it will not consult Hong Kong. So maybe some of these guys are totally undesirable people with previous convictions and so on, and yet the Hong Kong government is given no say as to who should not be allowed to come in. They decide, and of course they use that, they abused it, because they allow many of their agents or spies to come into Hong Kong. And then later on, their families will come to Hong Kong, their family members will come to Hong Kong for reunion. So for reunion purposes, and very often these people come and they register themselves first, they get a Hong Kong identity card, which is not a permanent one, only a Hong Kong identity card. They go back to China, wait for 7 years, they come again, and say, now, we have been living in Hong Kong for 7 years. The immigration office will not check, turn a blind eye to that, give them a chop. They become permanent residents of Hong Kong. They are registered as voters. And so on the election day, a lot of these people will be bussed from mainland China into Hong Kong. Each will be given a number. You just vote for number 2, and they do it, not knowing anything about Hong Kong. And so there are many of people of that kind, about 300,000.
But if there's anti-mainland sentiment among Hong Kongers, is that bad for Hong Kong because it allows people, mainland public opinion, to think Hong Kong people are not
Well,
to be
it
trusted?
should be that way. I mean, you're right in saying that there is a degree of hostility between Hong Kong people and between mainlanders. But this has come about because the government has failed to control the numbers, has failed to ensure that we have the capacity to receive these people. And you cannot blame Hong Kong people. You know, parents want to buy milk powder for their babies. And yet all the milk powders have been bought up by mainlanders coming in several times a day, buying up these milk powder and then doing business when they go across the border. In the same way, at one time, maternity beds were taken out by pregnant women from the mainland, and Hong Kong pregnant women cannot find a hospital bed to deliver their babies. So little wonder that there is this growing hostility. But it need not be that way, and the government can do something about it. There is also some hostility because we see hordes, hundreds of millions of mainland visitors. Yes, they do a great deal to boost our economy, and we welcome them. But they come in, they're not aware of our local culture, our local practices. I mean, mundane things like, for example, we're used to queuing up at bus stops. They're not. They come in and cut in any old house. And their personal habits also sometimes leave something to be desired. But it's something that you can do something about. I remember, I wasn't born in Hong Kong. I was born in Shanghai. I came to Hong Kong with my family in 1948. And I remember in the 50s and the 60s, the government used to mount huge annual campaigns to tell people you cannot spit in the streets, you cannot throw rubbish in the streets. So in the same way, I think we can mount similar educational programs. I'm sure mainlanders want as much to fit in with the local culture, with the local practices as possible, but they're not used to this. And furthermore, there's a real problem in that you have rich mainlanders coming in, buying up everything inside, hiking up property prices, so that today, young people who want to buy their own property find that all the properties are way beyond their affordability. So the government needs to address this fundamental problem. But we don't want mainlanders to feel that they are not welcome. They do. A lot of our businesses now in Hong Kong rely on mainland visitors.
All right, let's
These
collect.
are the,
Oh,
these are the byproducts of a successful Hong Kong. Why do people from the mainland come and buy our milk powder? Because their milk powder is already good.
all right, let's collect 2 questions at a time so that we can make sure we address more of the questions. So in the back under the camera, and then here with the red glasses. So one after the other.
Hi, Claudia Rosette with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Hi, Martin. I've been following this for a long, long time, and it always strikes me as ironic that if you behaved as do, say, the Palestinians, you would be getting world attention and negotiations and talks, or if you made yourselves a tremendous trouble to the rest of the world, there would be a lot more people here today. Instead, you are polite, you reason according to the declarations and promises that you got, and honestly, I have this terrible, overwhelming sense I've had since the 1980s of this steamroller that the world will not stop. My question is, could you tie this in for us more to the wider world? Russia has just chewed off a piece of Crimea despite an international agreement. Taiwan is looking at that. Where does Hong Kong sit in the constellation of precedents that are actually terribly important to, yeah, I'm trying to lean in this question. I think it does. But where does it sit? Can you locate it for us in today's world order, which is in some jeopardy on many fronts? Thank you.
World order. All right, let's take another question so we can get them stacked up.
Thank you very much. My name is Zhang Hong. I'm actually a journalist from China's Caixin Media, which is a Beijing-based media organization. Actually, I want to follow up with the previous point about the image of Hong Kong among the mainland people, because of the milk powder embargo and also those restrictions on pregnant women into Hong Kong, it created sort of very negative image of Hong Kong among ordinary Chinese people because they don't understand what democracy was about, why Hong Kong was fighting for democracy, but they do care about the possibility of going to Hong Kong to buy political products for their babies and to enjoy the freedom in Hong Kong. So I think something needs to be done, more needs to be done in terms of communicating with mainland people. It's not just about increasing the capability of Hong Kong government to govern. It's also about communication. And also I want to ask a question about what we are seeing the rise of Shanghai and Shenzhen as financial centers in China. And Hong Kong has traditionally played a strategic role in terms of being the financial center of bridging the capital flow into mainland China. So do you worry that with the rise of Shanghai and Shenzhen, with the weakening of democratic institutions in Hong Kong, the prospect for Hong Kong to stand up against Beijing and to demand its legitimate demands would be undermined?
Great, thank you. All right, so let's see if we can, the international and the...
Yeah, thank you for your question, Claudia. Hong Kong is tiny in area, but tiny Hong Kong maybe, it is of great importance, I dare say, to the rest of the world. Because Hong Kong used to be, and still is, the plank through which a lot of overseas investors would go into China. And likewise, a lot of people in China would come to Hong Kong as a plank to go overseas and so on. That's been Hong Kong's role all these years, all these hundreds of years. Now, and Hong Kong is what it is today, meaning a special administrative region of China, because of that agreement, the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Now, therefore, the rest of the world should look at the way China is implementing her own agreement with the British government and see whether those promises contained in that joint declaration are implemented and are honored by China. Because if the rest of the world see that it is not being honored and say nothing, you are really giving encouragement to China to break other international agreements. And so that cannot be proper. That cannot be right. In the words of Xi Jinping when he was in Paris just a few days ago, the lion has awakened. The lion says, don't worry, I'm a peaceful, loving lion. But it's time to remind our good leader, Greg, we'd like to see you remaining peaceful and loving. But if you would also honor your international agreements, start with the one on Hong Kong. You promise all these things to the Hong Kong people. We would believe that you are a loving lion if you show your love to your little pup, your little cub. Because in that context, Hong Kong becomes important. Because Hong Kong is what it is today because of this agreement.
I'll take your two questions. I agree we need to do more to improve communication between Hong Kong people and the mainland. But the hostility and the feeling of discrimination actually is on both sides. I'll give you one very simple example. These days, if you go into a Hong Kong shop selling name brands, Hong Kong people feel discriminated against because the first persons to be served are those who speak Putonghua, because the shop attendants know they have deep pockets and they will buy up everything inside. So if you are a Cantonese speaker, please step to one side and we'll serve you by and by. Okay? Secondly, yes, we are aware there is competition from Shenzhen, from Shanghai. But Hong Kong has always known that competition is actually good for us because it keeps us on our toes. And we don't underestimate the competition that we face from big cities and from medium-sized cities in the mainland. But in my view, for any province or any city to aspire to be a truly regional financial center, yes, you have plenty of hardware, but you need the software. And what are the software? You need a certain business environment. You need an independent judiciary so that business people know if they run into disputes, their disputes will be settled fairly in an open court. You need free flow of information. In other words, all the core values that we have in Hong Kong and which are enshrined in the basic law. These are Hong Kong's strengths. And if we want to remain ahead of the curve and remain the preeminent financial center for China, then we need to preserve these strengths and to impress upon mainland China that it's not just in Hong Kong's interest that you allow two systems to be faithfully implemented, but it's as much in the interest of China. Why does China use Hong Kong as its main offshore renminbi center? For precisely the reasons that I set out for you just now. So what is good for Hong Kong is good for our country as a whole. I mean, Martin and I are both Chinese. We're very proud of the achievements of leaders in the 4 decades of phenomenal economic growth since Deng Xiaoping embarked on the open door policy. We want to see a strong China. But I want to see, and I'm sure Martin wants to see, a China that is strong, not just economically, but a China that has increasing confidence in dealing with its own people on universal values. A China that will embrace universal values, that to me is a definition of a truly strong country. And I have no doubt China wishes to be taken seriously as a member of the international community.
If Shanghai were to overtake Hong Kong as a financial international center of China or of Southeast Asia, but keeping and acquiring all the core values that we had, because now our core values have come down, then it will be extremely good for Shanghai and for China. But if Hong Kong were to lose our core values because of the deliberate attempt on the part of the Chinese leadership to remove our core values, to make it easier for them to govern Hong Kong, then if on those terms Shanghai were to overtake us, it doesn't really do Shanghai any good or China any good, does it? So I don't mind if they overtake us, but I do insist that we keep our core values so that we will be competitive. And if Shanghai beats us, fine.
Thank you both very much. I think, unfortunately, we don't have time for more publicly asked questions. I believe that our guests will be around for a few minutes afterwards if you want to say hello. And so that was really very much in the nature of wrap-up remarks. Martin, is there any last comment you'd like to make before we let our audience go?
Well, Hong Kong has always got the support of our friends in this country. And on Capitol Hill, Hong Kong has always have had partisan support. And I hope this will continue. And I have no doubt this will continue. Because the values that we stand for are what you stand for. So if Hong Kong can be maintained as what Deng Xiaoping wanted it to continue to have, and what you would like Hong Kong to continue to be, then it can only be good for Hong Kong, but even better for China. And my vision is that China will continue to grow so that one day all the 1.3 billion people in China, maybe more by that time, will have their rights respected and guaranteed by an elected leadership.
These are very, very wonderful visions to hear you articulate so clearly. I think you've brought everyone over on your side, and we all want to thank you very much for coming to this.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.